The city lights twinkled below as the aircraft soared through the night sky, a blanket of stars stretching across the horizon. Inside the cabin, the air hummed with the quiet efficiency of flight attendants going about their duties. Among them were Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya, three women who had once believed that the skies were the limit. Geeta, the eldest of the trio, had always carried herself with a calm grace that belied the storms she faced in her personal life. A single mother to a teenage son, Geeta had joined Kohinoor Airlines over a decade ago, finding solace in the skies after the collapse of her marriage. Her calm demeanor made her the go-to person for passengers and crew alike, but beneath that calm exterior, she constantly worried about making ends meet. Jasmine, in contrast, was the life of the party, radiant, charming, and effortlessly sociable. She had dreams of becoming an actress but had taken up the job as a flight attendant to support herself while she waited for her big break. With her infectious laugh and quick wit, Jasmine could brighten even the dullest of flights. But behind that sparkling exterior lay the anxiety of a woman in her late 20s, still chasing dreams that felt further out of reach with each passing day. Divya, the youngest of the trio, was driven by ambition. A recent graduate with a degree in hospitality, she had joined Kohinoor Airlines with the hope of climbing the corporate ladder. Her enthusiasm for the job was palpable, and she was always eager to please, sometimes to the point of overextending herself. But beneath her determined exterior, Divya was haunted by the pressure to succeed and prove herself in a world that often felt overwhelming. The three women had formed an unbreakable bond, supporting each other through the ups and downs of life in the skies. But recently, their conversations during layovers had taken on a darker tone. Kohinoor Airlines, once a prestigious name in the industry, was now a shadow of its former self. Rumors of financial instability had been circulating for months, and the crew had felt the impact firsthand. Salaries were delayed, benefits were slashed, and the once vibrant airline was plagued by cost-cutting measures that made their jobs increasingly difficult. Geeta was the first to voice what they had all been thinking. "How long do you think we can keep this up? I'm barely making it as it is," she said one evening, as they sat in a dimly lit hotel room during a layover in Bangkok. Jasmine sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know, Geeta. I'm starting to wonder if it's worth it. Every month it's the same story, we'll get paid soon, but soon never comes." Divya, always the optimist, tried to keep the mood light. "We just have to hold on a little longer. Things will turn around, you'll see." But deep down, even Divya knew that their situation was becoming untenable. The airline's decline was accelerating, and with it, their hopes for a stable future. The three women were no longer just flight attendants, they were survivors, clinging to the last remnants of a dream that was slipping away. As their plane descended toward its destination, the trio exchanged weary glances, knowing that the turbulence in their lives had only just begun. Little did they know that a chance discovery on one of their flights would soon thrust them into a dangerous game of survival, one that would test their morals, their friendship, and their very will to live. For now, though, they focused on the task at hand, unaware that the skies they had once loved were about to become the setting for a drama far more intense than any they had encountered before. The fluorescent lights of Kohinoor Airlines headquarters flickered erratically, casting a dim glow over the once bustling office space. What had once been a symbol of prosperity and ambition now felt like a ghost town, with cubicles half empty and the faces of employees marked by stress and uncertainty. Kohinoor Airlines, once the pride of the nation, was in a freefall, and everyone from the top executives to the ground staff could feel the ground slipping beneath their feet. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya sat in a corner of the break room, each nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The tension in the room was palpable, a mix of frustration and anxiety that had become all too familiar. Paychecks had been delayed for the third consecutive month, and rumors were swirling that the airline was on the brink of bankruptcy. "It's not just the money," Geeta said, staring into her cup. "It's the uncertainty. How are we supposed to plan our lives when we don't even know if we'll have a job next month?" Jasmine nodded, her usual vivacity dimmed by the weight of the situation. "I can't even pay my rent this month. My landlord's already given me a warning. If this continues, I'll have to move back in with my parents, and that's the last thing I want." Divya, ever the optimist, tried to rally them. "I've heard rumors that they're trying to secure a new investor. Maybe things will turn around." But her words lacked conviction. They all knew the truth. Kohinoor Airlines was a sinking ship, and they were trapped on board with no lifeboat in sight. The financial troubles of the airline were evident everywhere. Maintenance checks were delayed, in-flight services were reduced, and the once proud fleet was slowly being grounded one aircraft at a time. The staff, who had once walked the corridors with pride, now moved with a quiet resignation, knowing that the end was near. That it was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that the trio first met Mr. Rajvanshi, their flight head. He was a man in his late 50s, with a sharp gaze and a stern demeanor that commanded respect. Rajvanshi had been with Kohinoor Airlines since its inception, a relic of its glory days. He had seen the airline through its best and worst times, and though he rarely spoke of it, there was a sense of loyalty and duty that bound him to the airline. "Rajvanshi is one of the few good ones left," Jasmine had said once, after a particularly grueling flight. "He doesn't complain, he just gets the job done. I don't know how he does it." But beneath his stoic exterior, Rajvanshi carried a burden of his own, a secret that would soon unravel in the most unexpected of ways. Then there was Mittal, the HR manager. A man in his 40s, Mittal was known for his smooth talking and ruthless efficiency. He had a reputation for getting things done, no matter the cost. In better times, Mittal had been seen as a rising star within the company, but as the airline's fortunes waned, so too did his popularity among the staff. "Mittal doesn't care about us," Divya had once said, her voice laced with frustration. "He's more concerned about keeping the higher-ups happy than making sure we're paid on time." It was Mittal who had delivered the news of the salary delays, standing in front of a room full of anxious employees with the same calm detachment he always displayed. "We're working on resolving the issue," he had said, offering little more than empty reassurances. "I assure you, your payments will be made as soon as possible." But "as soon as possible" had become a meaningless phrase, repeated so often that it had lost all credibility. For Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya, the pressure was mounting. Geeta's son needed tuition fees for his school, Jasmine was struggling to make ends meet in the expensive city, and Divya's family back home depended on her income to stay afloat. The delayed salaries were more than just an inconvenience, They were a threat to their very survival. As the weeks dragged on, the trio found themselves gathering more frequently, trying to find comfort in each other's company as the world around them crumbled. They had all joined Kohinoor Airlines with dreams of seeing the world, of building careers in an industry that promised glamour and excitement. But now, those dreams were slipping away, replaced by the harsh reality of a failing company and the personal struggles that came with it. It was during one of these late-night gatherings in the break room that they first noticed something unusual about Mr. Rajvanshi. He had always been a reserved man, but lately, he had become even more withdrawn, almost secretive. He was often seen talking to Mittal in hushed tones, and there were rumors that he had been flying more frequently, even on routes that didn't require a flight head of his seniority. "Something's not right," Geeta had said, her eyes narrowing as she watched Rajvanshi disappear into Mittal's office. "He's up to something, I can feel it." Jasmine shrugged, but there was a note of concern in her voice. "Maybe he's just trying to keep the airline afloat. He's been here forever, he probably knows more than any of us." But Divya wasn't convinced. "I don't know, there's something off about him lately. We should keep an eye on him." Little did they know, their suspicions were about to be confirmed in a way that would change their lives forever. As the days passed, the tension at Kohinoor Airlines continued to rise. The financial crisis showed no signs of abating, and the trio found themselves caught between their loyalty to the airline and their need to survive. The ground reality was harsh, and it was about to get even harsher for Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya. The skies were no longer a place of escape, they had become a battleground, where every flight could be their last and where the line between right and wrong was becoming increasingly blurred. And in the shadows, a conspiracy was brewing, one that would soon thrust them into a world of danger, deceit, and betrayal, where the only rule was survival. The morning dawned like any other, with the usual hustle and bustle at the airport as the crew prepared for another long-haul flight. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya went through their pre-flight routines, masking their growing worries with practiced smiles. Little did they know that this day would be anything but ordinary. The flight was scheduled to take off for Dubai, one of Kohinoor Airlines' most profitable routes, despite the airline's dwindling resources. Mr. Rajvanshi, their flight head, was already on board, overseeing the final preparations with his usual stern efficiency. The crew had become accustomed to his reserved nature, and most kept their distance, respecting the boundaries he had always maintained. As the passengers settled into their seats and the flight began its ascent, Geeta noticed that something was off with Mr. Rajvanshi. He seemed unusually pale, his hands trembling slightly as he handled the flight log. Concerned, she approached him. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Rajvanshi?" she asked, her voice laced with genuine concern. He looked up, his eyes glazed over as if he hadn't heard her. After a moment, he forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Geeta. Just a bit tired. Long night." Geeta nodded but remained unconvinced. She returned to her duties, but her mind kept drifting back to Rajvanshi's strange behavior. As the flight progressed, she noticed that he was becoming increasingly disoriented, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. By the time the plane was cruising at 35,000 feet, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. Rajvanshi had retreated to the flight deck, and when Geeta went to check on him, she found him slumped over in his chair, unconscious. "Jasmine, Divya, I need you here now." Geeta's urgent voice crackled over the intercom, sending a jolt of panic through the cabin crew. Within moments, the trio was gathered around the flight deck, trying to revive Rajvangshi. Despite their best efforts, it was too late. Mr. Rajvangshi had passed away, the cause of death unknown. The news spread quickly through the cabin, casting a pall over the rest of the flight. As the aircraft made an emergency landing in Muscat, the authorities were notified, and a flurry of activity ensued. The passengers were deboarded, and the crew was taken aside for questioning. The entire situation was shrouded in confusion and fear, with no clear answers in sight. After hours of waiting, the crew was finally allowed to return to their hotel, shaken by the events of the day. But for Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya, the nightmare was just beginning. Later that evening, as the trio sat in Geeta's hotel room, processing the day's events, Divya's mind kept returning to a small detail she had noticed in the chaos. As she and Jasmine had tried to revive Rajvangshi, something had fallen out of his jacket pocket, a small, metallic object that Divya had instinctively pocketed in the heat of the moment. "I found something," Divya said quietly, pulling out the object. It was a small, gold ingot, no larger than a pack of gum, intricately designed with markings she couldn't decipher. Jasmine's eyes widened. "Is that gold?" "It has to be," Geeta said, taking the ingot from Divya and inspecting it closely. "But why would Mr. Rajvangshi have something like this?" The room fell silent as the trio stared at the ingot, their minds racing with possibilities. It didn't take long for them to piece together the implications. Rajvangshi had been smuggling gold, and given the circumstances of his death, it was likely that this wasn't an isolated incident. "Do you think this is why he died?" Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe he was poisoned or something." Geeta shook her head. "I don't know. But this is serious. We need to be careful." As they debated what to do next, another realization hit them: Mittal. The HR manager had always been close to Rajvangshi, often seen in secretive discussions. The connection between the two men suddenly took on a more sinister tone. "What if Mittal is involved in this?" Divya suggested. "He and Rajvangshi were always talking in private. Maybe Mittal's the mastermind behind it all." The possibility sent a chill through the room. If Mittal was indeed behind the gold smuggling, it meant they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they had imagined. The trio knew they couldn't go to the authorities, not yet. They had no concrete evidence, just a gold ingot and their suspicions. But if they were right, they were now entangled in a criminal operation that could cost them their careers, or worse. As the night wore on, they discussed their options. They could turn the gold over to the authorities, but that would raise questions they weren't prepared to answer. Or they could confront Mittal and use their discovery to their advantage, leveraging their knowledge for financial gain. It was a dangerous game, but with Kohinoor Airlines on the brink of collapse and their financial situations growing more desperate by the day, the trio found themselves considering options they never would have before. In the end, they decided to wait and gather more information before making a move. They needed to understand the full scope of the operation before deciding their next steps, but as they drifted off to sleep that night, each of them knew that the skies had taken on a new, darker meaning. They were no longer just flight attendants, they were now players in a high-stakes game of smuggling, where one wrong move could bring their world crashing down, and with Mittal lurking in the shadows, they would have to tread carefully, lest they become the next casualties in a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the confines of Kohinoor Airlines. The atmosphere in Geeta's small apartment was thick with tension as the trio huddled around the dining table. The gold ingot they had found in Rajvangshi's possession sat between them, a silent testament to the gravity of their situation. It had been a few days since the discovery, and the weight of what they were contemplating had begun to take its toll. Geeta stared at the gold, her mind racing. "We're in way over our heads," she finally said, breaking the silence. "If we're right about Mittal, this isn't just about smuggling. This could destroy all of us. But we can't ignore it either," Jasmine countered, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her. "Look at our situation. We haven't been paid in months, the airline is falling apart, and we all have people depending on us. If we don't do something, we're going to lose everything." Divya nodded, her expression determined. "It's not like we're criminals. We're just trying to survive. If Mittal is really behind this, then he's the one who's in the wrong, not us. And if we can get him to let us in on it, we could turn things around for ourselves." The idea of blackmailing Mittal had been brewing in their minds since the moment they realized the extent of the operation. It was a dangerous proposition, but the alternative, remaining silent and continuing to struggle, seemed even worse. But what if it goes wrong? Geeta asked, her voice tinged with fear. "Mittal isn't the kind of man you want to cross. He could ruin us, or worse." Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "What choice do we have, Geeta? We're out of options. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about our families, our futures. If we do this right, we could walk away with enough money to start over. But if we don't take the risk, we're going to be stuck in this mess until it swallows us whole." The room fell silent as the trio weighed their options. The moral implications were clear: what they were about to do was illegal, and there was no guarantee that they would come out unscathed. But as they looked at the gold, the promise of a way out of their financial despair was too tempting to ignore. Finally, Geeta exhaled deeply, the decision settling heavily on her shoulders. "All right. We'll confront Mittal. But we need to be smart about it. We can't just go in guns blazing. We need to make sure we have leverage, something that will force him to agree." With the decision made, the trio spent the next few days gathering whatever information they could about Mittal and his dealings. They were cautious, knowing that any misstep could tip him off. But as they dug deeper, they found enough to confirm their suspicions. Mittal was indeed at the center of a gold smuggling ring, using the airline's flights to transport illicit goods under the radar. Armed with this knowledge, they planned their approach carefully. They would meet with Mittal in a public place, somewhere he couldn't easily lash out. They would present their evidence and make their demands clear, allow them to become carriers, or they would expose his operation. The day of the meeting arrived, and the trio found themselves sitting in a quiet corner of a cafe near the airport, their nerves on edge as they waited for Mittal to arrive. When he finally walked in, he looked as calm and collected as ever, his sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on them. "Ladies, Mittal greeted them smoothly as he sat down. To what do I owe the pleasure? Geeta took a deep breath, meeting his gaze head-on. We know about the gold smuggling operation, Mittal. We found one of the ingots on Rajvangshi's last flight. We know you're behind it. For a brief moment, a flicker of surprise crossed Mittal's face, but he quickly regained his composure. I see, he said, leaning back in his chair. And what exactly do you intend to do with this information? Jasmine leaned in, her voice steady. We're not here to cause trouble. But we're in a tight spot. We haven't been paid in months, and we have responsibilities. We want in on the operation. You let us carry the gold on our flights, and we won't say a word to anyone. Mittal's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he sized them up. You realize what you're asking for, don't you? This isn't some petty crime. You're talking about becoming criminals, and if you're caught, there won't be any coming back from it. We're already out of options, Divya said, her voice firm. This airline is going under, and we're going down with it. We need a way out, and this is the only one we see. For a long moment, Mittal said nothing, his gaze cold and calculating. The trio held their breath, wondering if they had pushed too far. But then, to their surprise, Mittal's expression softened, and he let out a small, humorless laugh. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he said, shaking his head. But this isn't just about guts. You're playing with fire. If I agree to this, you follow my rules to the letter. One mistake, and you're on your own. Do you understand? Relief washed over the trio as they nodded in unison. They had done it. They had secured a lifeline in the most unlikely of places. We understand, Geeta said, her voice steady. We'll follow your rules. Mittal leaned forward, his eyes boring into theirs. Good. Because if you don't, I won't hesitate to cut you loose. This operation is bigger than you can imagine, and there's no room for error. You're in now, but remember, this is a one-way street. There's no turning back. With that, Mittal stood, leaving the trio to contemplate the magnitude of what they had just committed to. They had crossed a line, one that would change their lives forever. As they watched Mittal walk away, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were now part of a criminal enterprise, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The offer they had made was one they couldn't refuse, but it came at a cost, one that would test their courage, their loyalty, and their very sense of right and wrong. For better or worse, they had made their choice. And now, there was no going back. The dawn of their first smuggling operation arrived with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya met at the airport earlier than usual, their nerves barely contained beneath their professional facades. The bustling airport, usually a place of routine and familiarity, now felt charged with a dangerous energy. Every passenger, every security check, seemed to hold the potential for disaster. As they moved through the pre-flight preparations, the reality of what they were about to do weighed heavily on them. The plan was simple, yet fraught with risk. Each of them would carry a small amount of gold hidden within their personal belongings, carefully concealed to avoid detection by the stringent airport security. The gold was discreetly handed to them by one of Mittal's associates, a shadowy figure who melted into the crowd as soon as the exchange was made. The trio had gone over the plan countless times, rehearsing every detail to ensure nothing went wrong. Yet, as the moments ticked by and the time to board approached, the magnitude of their decision hit them with full force. Are we really doing this? Divya whispered, her voice barely audible as they gathered in the crew lounge for a final check. Jasmine, who usually had a witty comeback for everything, simply nodded, her face pale. We don't have a choice now. We're in it, and we have to see it through. Geeta, ever the leader, took a deep breath and forced a calm smile. We've got this. Just stick to the plan, and don't let your nerves show. We've flown hundreds of times before, this is just another flight. But they all knew it wasn't. This flight would change everything. As they boarded the plane, the familiar sounds of passengers settling into their seats, the hum of the engines, and the routine safety announcements took on a surreal quality. Every step felt deliberate, every interaction scrutinized. The gold, hidden deep within their carry-on bags, felt like it weighed a ton. Geeta moved through the cabin with practiced grace, greeting passengers and ensuring that everyone was seated comfortably. But inside, her heart was pounding. She could feel the weight of the gold pressing against her consciousness with every movement, every smile. What if someone noticed? What if she slipped up? Jasmine and Divya, too, were battling their own inner turmoil. Every time they passed through the cabin, they couldn't help but glance at the passengers, searching for any signs of suspicion. Were the customs officers on board watching them? Was that businessman in the front row a covert agent? Their minds were racing, imagining threats where none existed. The flight itself was uneventful, yet each of the trio was acutely aware of every detail, the security announcements, the vigilance of the crew, the moments when passengers moved about the cabin. The calm exterior of the plane was a stark contrast to the storm of anxiety brewing inside them. Every time one of them interacted with a passenger, there was a fleeting moment of panic. Had they given something away? Were they being watched? As the plane reached cruising altitude and the passengers settled into their routines, the trio began to relax slightly. They exchanged glances, reassuring one another with small nods and smiles. They were doing it. They were actually pulling it off. But as the flight progressed, the reality of the stakes involved became ever more apparent. They weren't just playing a game, this was serious, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. The realization hit them hard. They were no longer just air hostesses. They had become criminals, and there was no turning back. Geeta felt it most keenly as the plane began its descent. The routine announcements felt almost mocking in their familiarity, a stark contrast to the illegal cargo hidden in the overhead bins. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew, that somehow, they had been discovered. When the plane touched down in Dubai, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The trio held their breath as the passengers began to disembark, each moment stretched out in agonizing suspense. The crew's smiles were fixed, their voices steady, but their minds were racing with fear. The customs checkpoint loomed ahead like a dark tunnel, and as they approached, each of them could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. The gold was hidden well, but would it be enough? Would the customs officers be able to see through their calm exteriors, to sense the fear lurking just beneath the surface. One by one, they passed through the checkpoint, their bags scanned and searched by indifferent customs officers. The process was agonizingly slow, every beep of the scanner sending a jolt of fear through their bodies. Geeta was the last to go through. She placed her bag on the conveyor belt and stepped back, forcing herself to breathe evenly as the officer scrutinized the screen. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, the weight of the operation pressing down on her shoulders. The officer glanced up at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, she was certain they had been caught. But then, with a curt nod, he waved her through. Geeta almost collapsed with relief as she joined Jasmine and Divya on the other side of the checkpoint. They had done it. They had actually done it. The trio walked through the airport in a daze, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. They had successfully smuggled gold on an international flight, and no one had noticed. The rush of adrenaline was intoxicating, but beneath it was a deep, unsettling realization: they were now fully entangled in the world of smuggling, and there was no going back. As they stepped out into the warm Dubai air, they exchanged glances, a mixture of triumph and fear in their eyes. The thrill of success was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. They had crossed a line, and the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. Jasmine was the first to break the silence. "We did it," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I can't believe we actually did it. But at what cost?" Geeta murmured, her gaze distant as she thought of the future. "We've just tied ourselves to something that could destroy us." Divya nodded solemnly. "There's no turning back now. We're in this, and we have to see it through. But we need to be careful. One mistake, and everything could come crashing down." They knew she was right. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was razor-thin. But for now, they had survived their first operation. They had proven to themselves, and to Mittal, that they were capable. As they headed to their hotel, the weight of the gold was gone, but a new weight had settled on their shoulders, the knowledge that they were now living a double life, one that could unravel at any moment. The thrill of the smuggling operation was undeniable, but so was the fear. And as the trio prepared for their next flight, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were now playing a dangerous game, where the only rule was survival. The first smuggling operation had gone off without a hitch, and as the days turned into weeks, the trio's confidence began to grow. They had crossed a threshold, and while the initial fear still lingered, it was now mixed with a sense of empowerment. They had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of their first operation, and the adrenaline rush had left them craving more. With each subsequent flight, Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya grew more adept at their new roles. They perfected their routines, learning how to move with the gold undetected, how to mask their nerves with calm professionalism. The fear of getting caught never fully dissipated, but it became something they learned to manage, a constant undercurrent in their lives. Their newfound income began to change things for them, too. After each operation, they would meet in Geeta's apartment, the location they had chosen for its privacy, to divide the profits. The small, unassuming living room became a place of both tension and relief as they counted the cash, each stack representing a measure of security they hadn't had before. "Finally, I can pay off that loan," Jasmine said one evening as she stuffed her share into an envelope. I was starting to think I'd be drowning in debt forever. Geeta nodded, slipping her own envelope into her purse. And I can finally send some money back home. My parents have been struggling, and it's been killing me that I couldn't do more for them. Divya smiled, though there was a hint of worry in her eyes. This is helping us, no doubt. But we can't get too comfortable. We've been lucky so far, but it only takes one mistake. Despite her words of caution, even Divya couldn't deny the relief that came with the money. It allowed her to manage her own pressing financial issues, to help her younger brother with his education, and to keep her head above water in a city that seemed determined to drag her down. But as the trio began to settle into their new reality, they knew they couldn't afford to become complacent. The stakes were still high, and the risks ever present. They had managed to keep their activities under the radar, but they were keenly aware that all it would take was one person asking the wrong questions to unravel everything. Their fears were not unfounded, and soon, they would have a new reason to be cautious. Mala Prasad, a seasoned customs officer with a reputation for her sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of justice, had recently been reassigned to the airport. Known among her colleagues for her no-nonsense approach and her uncanny ability to sniff out illegal activities, Mala was not someone to be taken lightly. Mala had been in her new post for only a few weeks when she began noticing irregularities in the passenger traffic on certain flights. Nothing concrete, just a few discrepancies here and there, small things that most would overlook. But Mala had been in the game long enough to know that where there was smoke, there was usually fire. As she dug deeper, her suspicions grew. Kohinoor Airlines, a struggling carrier barely managing to keep its planes in the sky, had caught her attention. The airline's financial woes were well known, and yet, there were rumors circulating about certain crew members who seemed to be living far beyond their means. It was enough to pique Mala's interest, and she began to keep a closer eye on the airline's flights, scrutinizing the crew rosters and passenger lists with renewed focus. One evening, as Mala sat in her office, sifting through a stack of reports, her mind kept returning to a specific flight. It was a routine trip to Dubai, but something about it didn't sit right with her. She decided to pull up the records, cross-referencing them with her growing list of suspicions. The names that appeared repeatedly on these flights were familiar to her now: Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya. Mala's instincts told her that these three weren't just ordinary flight attendants. There was something more going on, something hidden beneath the surface. She had seen it before: people who got too comfortable in their illicit activities, who started making mistakes when they thought they were untouchable. As she began her preliminary investigation, Mala knew she needed to be patient. If there was a smuggling ring operating within Kohinoor Airlines, it was likely well organized, and the last thing she wanted was to tip them off too early. She would bide her time, gather evidence, and when the moment was right, she would strike. Meanwhile, unaware of the growing scrutiny, Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya continued their operations, their confidence increasing with each successful flight. They had managed to find a rhythm, balancing their smuggling activities with their regular duties as air hostesses. To the outside world, they were just three women working to make a living, but behind closed doors, they were navigating a shadowy world of crime that demanded constant vigilance. But the signs of danger were beginning to appear. Geeta, always the most cautious of the three, started to notice small changes: an extra glance from a customs officer, a lingering look from a passenger. Nothing overt, but enough to set her on edge. She brought her concerns to Jasmine and Divya, but they brushed it off, attributing it to paranoia. They were doing everything right, they assured her. There was no reason to worry. Still, the unease lingered in the back of Geeta's mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that their luck might be running out. The money was good, but it came at a price, one that was beginning to weigh more heavily on her each day, and as Mala's investigation began to close in, the trio would soon find that their growing confidence was not enough to protect them from the dangers lurking in the shadows. The game they were playing was about to get a lot more dangerous, and the stakes were higher than they could have ever imagined. Mala Prasad sat in her dimly lit office, poring over the latest reports from her team. The faint glow of her computer screen illuminated her sharp features as she scanned the data, her mind working through the threads of suspicion she had begun to weave together. Kohinoor Airlines, once a blip on her radar, had become the focal point of her investigation, and her instincts told her she was closing in on something big. Her attention was drawn to a specific pattern she had noticed over the past few weeks, a series of flights between Mumbai and Dubai, all staffed by the same crew members, Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya. The flights were routine, the passenger lists unremarkable, but there was something about the consistency of the crew that set off alarm bells in her mind. Too often, the same people on the same routes, a pattern that, in her experience, often indicated something hidden beneath the surface. Mala leaned back in her chair, a frown creasing her forehead. She knew she needed more than just a hunch to act. The trio hadn't made any obvious mistakes, but if they were involved in smuggling, it was only a matter of time before they slipped up. She decided to ramp up her surveillance, subtly increasing scrutiny on their flights without alerting them to her interest. She would watch and wait, letting them believe they were still flying under the radar. Meanwhile, on the other side of the airport, the trio was preparing for another flight to Dubai. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya could all sense it, an invisible tension that had begun to creep into their routines, a sense of unease that was impossible to shake. As they made their way through the terminal, Geeta couldn't help but notice the extra glance from a security officer, the way a customs agent seemed to linger just a little too long as they passed. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, that they were simply being cautious, but the knot of anxiety in her stomach refused to loosen. "Did you see that?" Geeta whispered to Jasmine as they boarded the plane. "The way they looked at us. Something's not right." Jasmine shrugged, though her own unease was evident. "You're just paranoid, Geeta. We've done this enough times. If something was wrong, we'd know by now." But Divya, who had been listening quietly, gave a small nod. "Geeta's right. I've felt it too. We need to be more careful." The flight itself was a study in contrasts. Outwardly, everything was business as usual. The passengers were settled, the crew performed their duties with practiced ease, but beneath the surface, nerves were fraying. Every interaction felt charged with the potential for disaster, every routine task a test of their composure. As they cruised at 30,000 feet, Divya noticed a man in the first-class cabin watching them more closely than the others. He had been on several of their recent flights, always alone, always with a book that he never seemed to read. The way his eyes tracked their movements sent a shiver down her spine. "Jasmine, did you see that man?" Divya whispered when they had a moment in the galley. "The one in 1A? He's been on our flights before, and he's always watching us." Jasmine glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of the man. "Yeah, I've seen him. Could be nothing, but it's weird, I'll give you that." Geeta joined them, her voice low. "We need to stay focused. If something's going on, we can't afford to panic. Just do everything by the book, and don't give anyone a reason to suspect us." The rest of the flight was a blur of nervous energy. Every interaction with passengers felt like a potential trap, every glance from a fellow crew member a silent accusation. By the time they touched down in Dubai, the trio was on edge, their usual composure cracked by the pressure of maintaining their cover. At the customs checkpoint, the tension reached its peak. The trio approached the officers, trying to mask their anxiety with forced smiles and casual conversation. But the process seemed to drag on, the officers more thorough than usual, their questions more probing. When it was finally Geeta's turn, she could feel the sweat on her palms as she handed over her passport. The officer behind the counter, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, studied her documents for what felt like an eternity before finally waving her through. Geeta let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding as she joined Jasmine and Divya on the other side. "That was too close," Geeta muttered as they walked away from the checkpoint, her heart still racing. "We're losing our nerve," Divya replied, her voice tinged with worry. "We need to calm down, or we're going to make a mistake." But the truth was, all three of them were beginning to unravel. The constant fear of being caught was starting to take its toll, eroding the confidence they had built up over their previous operations. They knew they couldn't keep this up forever, but the allure of the money and the desperation of their personal situations kept pulling them back in. Back in her office, Mala was reviewing the latest reports from her team. She had started placing plainclothes officers on some of the Kohinoor flights, their task to observe without being seen. The feedback she received was mixed, nothing definitive, but enough small details to confirm her suspicions. The trio was good at what they did, but no one was perfect, and Mala knew it was only a matter of time before they slipped. As the weeks went by, the pressure continued to mount for Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya. Each new flight felt like a gamble, a high-stakes game where the odds were slowly turning against them. They began to double-check their routines, scrutinizing every detail to avoid detection, but the paranoia was growing. Even in their personal lives, the stress was beginning to show: short tempers, restless nights, and a constant sense of being watched. One evening, as they gathered in Geeta's apartment to divide the latest profits, the atmosphere was tense. The money was still flowing, but the cost of earning it was becoming increasingly clear. "We can't keep doing this," Geeta said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she counted the cash. "It's only a matter of time before something goes wrong." Jasmine looked up, her expression hard. "We don't have a choice, Geeta. We're in too deep. We have to see this through, whatever it takes." Divya nodded in agreement, though her face was pale. "But we need to be smarter about it. We can't let the fear get to us. We've been careful so far, and we just need to stay that way." But deep down, all three of them knew the truth: the walls were closing in. The life they had chosen was not one that allowed for mistakes, and the longer they continued, the more they risked everything they had worked for, and as Mala's investigation closed in, the trio would soon find themselves caught in a web of suspicion, where every move was scrutinized, and every step could be their last. The air around them was thick with tension, and the shadow of discovery loomed larger with each passing day. The thrill of success had carried Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya through several dangerous operations, but the cracks were beginning to show. They knew they were playing a dangerous game, but the rewards were too tempting, and the pressure of their personal lives left them with little choice. Yet, as they planned their next smuggling operation, a sense of foreboding hung over them like a dark cloud. This time, the job was different, riskier. The gold was heavier, the route more closely monitored, and the margin for error thinner than ever. Mittal, their reluctant accomplice, had assured them it was a one-time deal, a high-stakes operation with a massive payout. But even he seemed more on edge than usual, his calm demeanor replaced with nervous energy. As they gathered in Geeta's apartment to discuss the details, the tension in the room was palpable. "We can't afford any mistakes on this one," Jasmine said, her voice tight with anxiety. "The payoff is huge, but so is the risk. We need to be on our game, every second." Divya nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The plan is solid, but we've got to stick to it. No improvising, no second-guessing. We're going to be under more scrutiny than ever." Geeta, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "I don't like this. It's too much, too soon. We're pushing our luck, and I have a bad feeling about it." But there was no turning back. The operation had been set in motion, and they were committed, whether they liked it or not. The day of the flight arrived, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. As the trio moved through the terminal, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every glance from security, every casual remark from a colleague, seemed loaded with suspicion. Geeta's unease only grew as they boarded the plane. This time, the weight of the gold hidden in their luggage felt heavier, more oppressive. She could see the strain in Jasmine's eyes and the tightness in Divya's movements, but none of them dared to voice their fears. As the plane took off, the usual sense of calm that settled over them during a flight was absent. Instead, there was an almost palpable anxiety, a tension that made every second feel like a countdown to disaster. Halfway through the flight, things started to go wrong. It began with a minor turbulence, the kind that usually didn't faze them, but today it felt different, an omen. The passengers were restless, the crew on edge. Then came the announcement that would send their carefully laid plans spiraling out of control, a random security check on arrival. Geeta's heart sank. A security check meant they would have to go through an additional screening, a process that would increase their chances of being caught. She exchanged a panicked look with Jasmine and Divya, both of whom were trying to keep their composure. "We have to stick to the plan," Jasmine whispered fiercely. "We can't afford to panic now." But as the plane began its descent, the trio's nerves were frayed. Every possible scenario raced through their minds: getting caught, the fallout, the consequences that would follow. As they landed and taxied to the gate, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. The passengers began to disembark, and the crew prepared to go through the additional screening. The trio moved with forced calm, their minds racing with contingency plans, but they knew they were walking a tightrope. As they approached the security checkpoint, Geeta's hands were clammy, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The officers seemed more alert than usual, their eyes scanning every detail with an intensity that made her want to turn and run. She could see Jasmine and Divya trying to maintain their composure, but the fear was written on their faces. One by one, they passed through the scanner. Geeta went first, holding her breath as she stepped through. The machine beeped, and she felt a wave of panic, but the officer waved her through. Jasmine followed, then Divya, both barely managing to keep their anxiety in check, but just as they thought they were in the clear, a second officer called them back. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, his tone polite but firm. "We need to do an additional check on your bags." Geeta's stomach dropped. This was it, the moment they had feared. They had no choice but to comply, trying to keep their expressions neutral as they handed over their bags. The officers began to search through their belongings, every movement slow and deliberate. As the seconds ticked by, the trio's anxiety grew. Geeta felt the weight of the gold in her suitcase like a ticking time bomb. If they found it, everything would be over: Mittal's protection, their financial lifeline, their freedom. But just as the officer's hand brushed close to the hidden compartment, a commotion erupted at the other end of the checkpoint. A passenger was causing a scene, yelling about lost luggage and demanding to speak to a supervisor. The officers turned their attention to the disturbance, and in the ensuing chaos, the search of their bags was abruptly cut short. "You're free to go," the officer said, distracted by the growing commotion. The trio wasted no time, grabbing their bags and hurrying through the checkpoint. It wasn't until they were safely out of the terminal that they allowed themselves to breathe again. They had narrowly escaped disaster, but the close call had left them shaken. As they regrouped at Geeta's apartment later that night, the atmosphere was tense. "That was too close," Divya said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep doing this. It's not worth it." Jasmine, always the most resolute, nodded in agreement. "We need to rethink everything. We can't afford another slip-up like that." Geeta, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "This was a warning. We're pushing our luck, and it's going to run out if we're not careful." But as much as they wanted to walk away, they knew they were trapped by their own choices. The money had become a lifeline, and the thought of going back to their previous struggles was unbearable. They were caught in a cycle of risk and reward, unable to break free. Meanwhile, Mala Prasad was closing in. The random security check had been her doing, part of a strategy to test her growing suspicions. She had seen the trio's reactions, their barely concealed fear, and it had only confirmed what she already knew: they were hiding something. Mala began to piece together the puzzle, reviewing surveillance footage, flight records, and crew manifests. The patterns were becoming clearer, the connections more solid. She was getting closer to the truth, and it was only a matter of time before she had enough evidence to make her move. As Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya faced the growing dangers of their double lives, Mala was preparing to bring the full force of the law down on them. The high-stakes game they were playing was about to come crashing down, and the consequences would be more severe than they could have ever imagined. The aftermath of the near-disastrous smuggling operation left Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya shaken, but there was little time to dwell on their fears. Mittal had heard about the close call, and his reaction was swift and ruthless. The once reluctant partner had turned into a menacing figure, tightening his grip on the trio as he sought to protect himself and ensure the continued flow of illegal profits. The trio knew they were in deeper than ever. Mittal was no longer the quiet, calculating HR manager they had blackmailed. He was now their puppeteer, pulling the strings with a vicious determination. He demanded more from them, more flights, more gold, more risk. The once manageable operations were becoming increasingly dangerous, and the stress was wearing them down. "Mittal's not going to let us go," Jasmine said, her voice tinged with desperation as they met in Geeta's apartment to discuss their next move. "He's making us take bigger risks, and if anything goes wrong, we're the ones who will pay for it." Divya nodded, her face pale. "He knows we're scared, and he's using it against us. We need to find a way out, but I don't know how." Geeta, who had been silently pacing the room, finally stopped and looked at her friends. "We can't let him control us like this. If we keep doing what he says, we're going to get caught, or worse. We need to take back control." But even as they discussed their options, they knew the truth: Mittal had them cornered. The money was too good to walk away from, and their personal lives were too precarious to risk losing it. They were trapped, and the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, Mala Prasad was carefully laying her own trap. The customs officer had been watching the trio closely, her suspicions growing with each passing day. The close call at the security checkpoint had confirmed her hunch, and she was determined to bring them down. Mala's strategy was simple: she would let the trio think they were still in control, allowing them to continue their operations while she gathered the evidence she needed. But this time, she would be waiting for them, ready to catch them in the act. Mala increased the surveillance on their flights, planting undercover agents among the passengers and crew. She studied their patterns, looking for any inconsistencies, any slip-ups that could give her the upper hand. She was patient, methodical, and relentless, but the trio was not entirely oblivious to the danger. They sensed the tightening noose, the growing scrutiny that surrounded them. Geeta's instincts, always sharp, were screaming at her that something was wrong. "We need to be extra careful," Geeta warned as they prepared for their next flight. "I don't trust this. There's too much heat on us right now, and I think someone's watching." Jasmine and Divya exchanged uneasy glances but nodded in agreement. They knew Geeta was right, but they also knew there was little they could do. The operation was already in motion, and they had no choice but to go through with it. As they boarded the plane, the tension was unbearable. Every step felt like walking on a tightrope, every glance from a passenger or crew member a potential threat. They went through the motions of their job with forced smiles and practiced efficiency, but inside, they were unraveling. The flight was long and grueling, the weight of the hidden gold a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Geeta couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong, her nerves fraying with each passing hour. As they began their descent, the atmosphere in the cabin grew even more tense. The trio exchanged nervous looks, knowing that the real danger was waiting for them on the ground. At the airport, Mala and her team were ready. The security checkpoint was a carefully orchestrated trap, designed to catch the trio off guard. The officers were in place, the scanners calibrated to detect even the smallest trace of gold. Mala herself was watching from the sidelines, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of her targets. As Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya approached the checkpoint, the tension was palpable. They could feel the weight of the gold in their bags, the stares of the officers, the cold sweat on their skin. But they had no choice but to move forward, praying that their luck would hold out one more time, but this time, their luck ran out. As they passed through the scanner, the alarm went off. The officers immediately closed in, pulling them aside for a more thorough search. Geeta's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the officers open her bag, their hands moving with clinical precision. They found the gold almost instantly. The trio's world came crashing down around them as the officers confiscated the contraband, their expressions grim. There was no escape, no quick fix this time. They were caught, and there was no denying the evidence. Mala stepped forward, her eyes cold as she looked at the three women who had thought they could outsmart the system. "It's over," she said, her voice firm. "You're under arrest for smuggling and conspiracy." Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya were led away in handcuffs, their dreams of easy money shattered. The golden trap had snapped shut, and they were caught in its jaws. As they were taken into custody, their minds raced with the consequences of their actions. The lives they had tried so hard to protect were now in ruins, and the future they had hoped for was slipping away. But as they faced the reality of their situation, one question lingered in their minds: was there any way out of this mess, or had they finally reached the end of the line? Back at the airport, Mittal watched the events unfold from a distance, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He had played his cards well, using the trio as pawns in his larger game. And now, as the authorities focused on Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya, he would quietly slip away, free to continue his operations elsewhere. But Mittal's confidence might have been misplaced. Mala wasn't just focused on the trio, she had her sights set on the bigger fish. And as she prepared to unravel the rest of the smuggling ring, she knew that Mittal's time would come. The game was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The sun was setting as the final flight of the series prepared for takeoff. Kohinoor Airlines Flight 765, bound for Dubai, was a routine journey on the surface, but for Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya, it was the climax of their high-stakes ordeal. The trio, despite their recent arrest and subsequent release on bail, were once again embroiled in smuggling, their desperation to pay off debts and escape their predicament driving them to take one last risk. Mittal, who had orchestrated the operation with a sinister efficiency, had promised this flight would be their last. He had leveraged their fears, knowing they had no choice but to comply. The gold they were smuggling was more than usual, large, heavy, and packed into compartments carefully designed to evade detection. The trio had been given clear instructions: complete the operation, and they would finally be free of Mittal's control. But freedom felt increasingly elusive. As they boarded the plane, Geeta's anxiety was at an all-time high. She couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be their undoing. Jasmine and Divya shared her apprehension but remained stoic, focusing on their roles as if performing a well-rehearsed play. Meanwhile, Mala Prasad was on board the flight under the guise of a routine inspection. Her investigation had led her to this flight, and she had received intelligence suggesting this was where the smuggling operation would reach its peak. With undercover agents discreetly placed among the passengers and crew, she was prepared for the inevitable confrontation. As the plane ascended, the mood in the cabin was tense. The trio moved through their duties with practiced efficiency, trying to appear calm despite the looming threat. Geeta was hyper-aware of every movement, every glance from a passenger, every sound. She knew that this time, they had to be perfect, but fate had other plans. The moment the plane reached cruising altitude, Mala made her move. She approached the cockpit, where the pilot was unaware of the unfolding drama, and asked to speak with the trio privately. With a professional demeanor and the authority of her badge, she requested to see them in the galley. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya exchanged nervous glances but followed Mala to the galley. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they entered the small space, feeling the walls close in around them. Mala closed the door behind them and turned to face the trio. "I've been watching you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I know what you're doing. And I'm here to put an end to it." The trio's faces paled as Mala's words sank in. They had hoped to evade capture, to make it through this last operation and disappear into the night. But now, confronted with Mala, their worst fears were coming true. "Please," Jasmine pleaded, her voice trembling. "We just need this one last job. After this, we're done. We'll walk away." Mala shook her head. "It doesn't work like that. You've already crossed too many lines. The evidence against you is irrefutable." But just as the situation seemed hopeless, a shocking twist unraveled. The lights in the galley flickered, and the plane experienced a sudden jolt of turbulence. Geeta's eyes widened in realization as she noticed a strange figure moving toward them, a man in a dark suit, his face partially obscured. "Mala," the man shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You're too late. Mittal's already one step ahead of you." Before anyone could react, the man drew a gun, his intentions clear. The cabin erupted into confusion as passengers and crew were thrown into panic. Mala quickly moved to protect herself and the trio, her hand reaching for her own weapon. The man's appearance was a wild card, an unexpected player in the already volatile situation. He was clearly working with Mittal, aiming to derail Mala's efforts and ensure the smuggling operation's success. But in the confusion, the real scope of the plot began to unfold. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya, now caught between Mala and the mysterious intruder, faced a choice: surrender to the authorities or join the fray to protect themselves. Their fear turned to resolve as they realized that their survival hinged on taking action. The confrontation was chaotic. Mala and the man exchanged fire, the cabin's turbulence amplifying the danger. In the midst of the chaos, Geeta made a split-second decision. She grabbed a nearby extinguisher and, with a burst of courage, struck the intruder, knocking him to the floor. As the intruder fell, the commotion settled, and the plane's emergency lights illuminated the galley. Mala, catching her breath and regaining control, looked at the trio with a mixture of relief and frustration. "This isn't over," she said. "You're still going to face justice for what you've done." But Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya were not willing to accept their fate without a fight. With the plane still in turbulence and the danger of the situation escalating, they made a desperate bid for freedom. They attempted to flee, hoping to find a way out before the authorities could fully restrain them. The struggle continued as the plane began its descent into Dubai. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya, despite their efforts to escape, were finally overpowered by the combined force of Mala's team and the flight crew. The gold, their last hope of evading justice, was confiscated, and they were subdued. As the plane touched down, the scene was one of complete disarray. Passengers and crew were escorted off the plane, while Mala and her team conducted a thorough search and arrested the trio. Mittal's plans had been thwarted, but the real impact of the operation was only beginning to be felt. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya were led away in handcuffs, their dreams of escape shattered. The final descent of their tumultuous journey had brought them to a reckoning, and the consequences of their actions were about to catch up with them. Mala, though victorious, knew that this was just the beginning. The web of corruption and crime extended far beyond what she had uncovered. Mittal, still at large, was a threat that would need to be dealt with in the days to come. As the trio faced their inevitable fate, the truth of their choices and the consequences of their actions lay heavy on their shoulders. The final descent had brought them face to face with their past, their present, and the uncertain future that awaited them. The chaotic aftermath of Flight 765's final descent left a trail of devastation that extended far beyond the plane's emergency landing. The fallout from the smuggling operation reverberated through every aspect of the lives involved, from the consequences faced by the trio to the uncertain future of Kohinoor Airlines. As Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya were taken into custody and the investigation unfolded, the full extent of their illegal activities came to light. The media frenzy surrounding the case was intense, with headlines splashed across newspapers and news channels detailing the dramatic story of the air hostesses turned smugglers. The public's reaction was a mix of shock, outrage, and sympathy, as the personal struggles of the trio were laid bare. Mala Prasad, the customs officer who had orchestrated their downfall, was hailed as a hero for her role in dismantling the smuggling ring. Her meticulous investigation and bravery in the face of danger earned her commendations from her superiors and the public alike. But for Mala, the victory was bittersweet. The case had revealed just how deeply entrenched corruption could be, and her work was far from over. In the immediate aftermath, the trio faced severe legal consequences. They were charged with multiple counts of smuggling, conspiracy, and other related crimes. The legal process was swift but brutal, and their attempts to negotiate plea deals were met with resistance from the authorities, who were determined to make an example of them. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya each faced their own personal and legal battles. The weight of their actions, combined with their high-profile arrests, made their journey towards redemption or ruin all the more poignant. Struggling with a mix of guilt and defiance, Geeta sought to make amends by cooperating fully with the authorities and providing information about the smuggling network. Her willingness to come clean was met with some leniency in her sentencing, but the damage to her personal life was irreversible. She faced a lengthy prison term but hoped that her cooperation would pave the way for a reduced sentence and a chance at rebuilding her life once she was released. Jasmine, who had been the most resolute of the trio, found her world crumbling as the charges piled up. Her once stable personal life was shattered, and she faced a significant prison term. The trial revealed the depth of her financial struggles and the desperation that drove her to make the choices she did. Jasmine's path to redemption was fraught with challenges, and she had to confront the harsh reality of her actions and their impact on her family. Divya's situation was particularly dire. She had been struggling with personal issues and found herself caught in a web of deceit and desperation. Her role in the smuggling operation was seen as a result of her personal struggles, and while she received some sympathy, the legal consequences were severe. Divya faced a lengthy sentence and was left to grapple with the choices she had made and the future she had jeopardized. The exposure of the smuggling ring had far-reaching effects on Kohinoor Airlines. The airline, already teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, found itself in a deeper crisis. The scandal eroded public trust, and the financial repercussions were severe. Passenger numbers dwindled, and investors pulled out, leaving the airline struggling to stay afloat. In the wake of the scandal, Kohinoor Airlines underwent significant restructuring. The management team was overhauled, with many executives, including Mittal, facing legal repercussions for their roles in the smuggling operation. The airline was forced to sell off assets, reduce its fleet, and lay off staff in a desperate attempt to recover from the financial blow. Despite the turmoil, there was a glimmer of hope. A new management team, committed to transparency and rebuilding trust, took over the airline. They focused on restoring the company's reputation and implementing rigorous checks to prevent future scandals. While the road to recovery was long and uncertain, the new leadership aimed to steer Kohinoor Airlines towards a more stable future. As the dust settled, the fallout from the smuggling operation left behind a landscape of broken lives and shattered dreams. Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya faced their respective fates, their paths to redemption marked by the harsh reality of their choices. Kohinoor Airlines, too, faced a long journey of recovery and renewal, determined to rebuild from the ashes of its scandalous past. The story of the trio and the airline was a stark reminder of the complex interplay of desperation, deception, and redemption. As the final chapter closed on their tumultuous journey, the impact of their actions continued to echo through their lives and the world they had left behind. The aftermath of the heist had left a profound impact on Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya. As they faced the consequences of their actions, each woman embarked on a new chapter of her life, shaped by the experiences and choices that had brought them to this point. After serving a reduced sentence for her cooperation with the authorities, Geeta was released from prison. The years behind bars had been a period of intense reflection and personal growth. Determined to make a fresh start, Geeta sought employment in a field far removed from aviation and smuggling. She found solace in working with a non-profit organization that provided support to women in crisis. Her past became a driving force for her dedication to helping others avoid similar pitfalls. Though the scars of her past remained, Geeta was committed to using her experience to make a positive difference in the world. Jasmine's journey was more tumultuous. Her sentence was longer, and the impact on her personal life was profound. She spent her time in prison working on education and self-improvement, trying to reconcile with the choices she had made. Upon her release, Jasmine struggled to rebuild her life from the ground up. She faced significant challenges in finding stable employment and reconnecting with family and friends. Despite the hurdles, Jasmine remained determined to move forward, taking small steps towards rebuilding her shattered life and finding a sense of purpose beyond her past mistakes. Divya's situation was particularly difficult. The lengthy sentence and the deep personal struggles she had faced made her path to redemption arduous. After her release, she sought therapy and support groups to address her issues and rebuild her life. Her efforts to reintegrate into society were met with mixed success, as the shadows of her past continued to follow her. Divya worked hard to maintain a semblance of normalcy, seeking solace in small victories and the support of those who understood her journey. Her future remained uncertain, but she remained hopeful that her efforts to change her life would eventually pay off. As Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya navigated their new lives, they often reflected on the choices that had led them to their current circumstances. The heist that had seemed like a desperate bid for survival had ultimately resulted in profound changes in their lives. Geeta found herself grappling with the moral implications of her actions. Her reflections led her to a deeper understanding of the complexities of desperation and the human condition. She worked to channel her experiences into positive actions, determined to prevent others from making similar choices. Jasmine's reflections were tinged with regret and a longing for a different path. Her journey involved confronting the pain she had caused and coming to terms with the consequences of her decisions. Despite the obstacles she faced, Jasmine remained resolute in her desire to rebuild her life and make amends for her past. Divya's reflections were marked by a struggle to forgive herself. The weight of her choices and their impact on her life were constant reminders of her mistakes. However, her ongoing efforts to address her issues and seek redemption were a testament to her resilience and determination to create a better future for herself. As the women looked to the future, the horizon was filled with uncertainty. Their past actions had left an indelible mark on their lives, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Yet, each woman faced the future with a mixture of hope and trepidation. For Geeta, the future held the promise of continued personal growth and a chance to make a difference in the lives of others. Her new path was one of redemption, and she embraced the opportunity to contribute positively to society. Jasmine's journey was one of rebuilding and resilience. Her future was uncertain, but her determination to move forward and find stability was a beacon of hope. She remained committed to her personal growth and to overcoming the barriers that lay ahead. Divya's future was perhaps the most uncertain. The struggle to overcome her past and build a new life was ongoing, but she faced each day with a sense of cautious optimism. Her path was difficult, but she continued to strive for a better future, holding on to the hope that her efforts would eventually lead to a more stable and fulfilling life. As the sun set on their tumultuous journey, Geeta, Jasmine, and Divya each stood at the edge of a new horizon, their futures shaped by their pasts and the choices they had made. The road ahead was one of uncertainty, but the lessons learned and the strength gained from their experiences provided a foundation for their continued journey towards redemption and renewal.